The heavy rain was hammering against the roof of the hangar like 1,000 frantic fingers, but inside, the air was deathly still. I stood at the back of the crowd, my grease-stained cap pulled low, feeling the familiar weight of being a ghost in a room full of polished brass and stiff collars. Up on the stage, the Major was mid-sentence, his voice booming about sacrifice and the long road home, until his eyes drifted toward the back. Toward me. He stopped dead. The silence that followed wasn't just a pause. It was the kind of vacuum that happens right before a storm breaks. His gaze wasn't on my face, but on the dull glimmer of the heavy silver ring on my right hand, the one with the notched edge and the faded unit crest. He went pale, his hand trembling as he gripped the podium, and I knew right then that the quiet life I'd built behind the wheel of a Peterbilt was about to collide head-on with a past I'd spent 15 years trying to outrun. Before we continue, let us know where you're tuning in from. Drop your city and mile marker in the comments. You're watching Highway Stories Untold, and we love seeing how far these stories travel. The vibration of the road usually keeps the ghosts at bay. That steady, rhythmic hum of rubber on asphalt, the white noise of the diesel engine, the hypnotic blur of painted lines disappearing beneath my hood. It's the closest thing to meditation I've ever found. That's why I like the long hauls. The ones where the highway stretches out into the black horizon like an endless ribbon, where the only things I have to worry about are the temperature gauge on my reefers and whether the coffee in my thermos has gone cold. But I'd made the mistake of pulling into this small-town VFW post in rural Ohio, just outside of Canton, thinking I could slip in quietly, pay my respects to an old friend's memory, and be back in the cab before the first light of sunrise crept over the cornfields. I didn't want a seat at the table with the dignitaries. I didn't want the handshakes or the hollow "thank you for your service" from people who had no idea what that service had cost. I just wanted to see the photo they were dedicating, a portrait of Sarah's husband, a man named Marcus Webb, who'd saved my life in a dusty valley 3,000 miles away, in a place that most Americans couldn't find on a map, even if their lives depended on it. The plan was simple. Stand in the back, stay invisible, observe the ceremony from the shadows, and disappear before anyone recognized the face that was supposed to be buried in a classified file somewhere in the Pentagon's basement. But plans have a way of falling apart the moment they meet reality, especially when that reality includes men like Elias Thorne. I was leaning against the cold corrugated metal wall near the emergency exit, my boots still caked with the red Ohio clay from the parking lot that had turned into a swamp under the relentless downpour. The room was packed wall to wall with what I call important people. Local politicians in cheap suits that didn't quite fit right, their ties knotted too tight around soft necks that had never known the weight of combat gear. There were high-ranking officers, too, the kind who liked the sound of their own medals clinking when they walked, who wore their ribbons like armor against questions they didn't want to answer. And then there was the man of the hour, the one they kept introducing as the benefactor, a slick, silver-haired real estate developer named Elias Thorne. He was everything I'd learned to despise in my years on the road. Polished on the surface, rotten underneath, the kind of man who measured worth in dollar signs and saw people as assets to be acquired or obstacles to be removed. He sat in the front row like he owned the building and the souls inside it, which, given what I'd heard whispered in the parking lot, he probably thought he did. His suit was custom-tailored, probably cost more than my entire rig, and his shoes had that mirror shine that comes from never doing a day of real work. I'd seen his type before, in corporate boardrooms and government offices, men who wielded power like a blunt instrument and never faced consequences for the damage they caused. But it wasn't Thorne that made my jaw tighten and my hands curl into fists. It was where his attention was focused. It was the way his hand rested, too heavily, too possessively, on the shoulder of a young widow sitting beside him, a woman whose world had already been shattered by loss and who didn't need a predator circling her grief like a shark smelling blood in the water. Sarah Webb. She looked smaller than the last time I'd seen her, diminished somehow, as if the weight of her mourning had compressed her into something fragile and breakable. Her knuckles were white, where she clutched the folded American flag that had draped her husband's casket, the fabric pressed against her chest like a shield that offered no real protection. The flag was pristine, perfectly creased, but I could see the tremor in her hands, the way her shoulders hunched forward, as if she were trying to make herself invisible. Thorn was leaning in close to her, his lips moving as he whispered something that I couldn't hear from my position at the back of the room. Whatever he was saying made her flinch, a visible recoil that sent a spike of cold fury through my chest. His eyes were roaming the room with a predator's confidence, cataloguing faces, measuring influence, calculating angles. This wasn't about honoring the fallen. This was about power and control and exploitation. I felt that old, familiar heat rising in my chest, the kind that starts deep in the gut like smoldering coals and spreads through your veins until your hands feel like stones and your vision narrows to a pinpoint focus. It's a dangerous feeling, one I'd learned to control through years of discipline and distance, through choosing the solitude of the highway over the complications of human conflict. I told myself to stay back. "Not your fight, Jack," I whispered under my breath. "You're just a trucker passing through. Just a ghost who's supposed to stay dead. Just a man who traded his rifle for a steering wheel and promised himself he'd never look back." But then Thorn's hand moved. It slid from Sarah's shoulder down to the small of her back in a gesture that was proprietary, forceful, possessive, in a way that made my blood boil. It was a touch that said, "You belong to me now." A touch that ignored her obvious discomfort, her subtle attempts to lean away, her eyes welling up with tears she was fighting desperately to keep back. That was the first line. The invisible boundary that separated staying hidden from stepping into the light. The moment where the ghost becomes flesh again. I didn't think. Thinking is what gets you killed in situations like this, what makes you hesitate when hesitation means someone else pays the price for your cowardice. I just moved. I stepped out of the shadows, my heavy tread echoing on the concrete floor like the deliberate footfalls of judgment itself. The sound carried in the hushed space, a rhythmic thud-thud-thud that made heads turn, conversations falter, attention shift toward the back of the room, where a man in a worn canvas Carhartt jacket and mud-splattered work boots was striding toward the front, with purpose written in every step. A few people turned fully, their eyes widening as they took in the sight of someone who clearly didn't belong in this carefully curated ceremony. I could see the questions forming on their faces. Who is this? What is he doing? Doesn't he know this is for important people only? I didn't care. My eyes were locked on Thorn's hand, on the way his fingers pressed into Sarah's back, on the smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the smile of a man who thought he could do whatever he wanted because money and influence had always protected him before. The Major was still on stage, frozen mid-gesture, his mouth half open, in an unfinished sentence about sacrifice and honor and the long road home. But he wasn't looking at his notes anymore. He wasn't looking at the audience. He was looking at me, and more specifically at my right hand, at the ring, the heavy silver band with the notched edge and the faded unit crest that only a handful of men would recognize. The ring that marked me as part of operations that didn't officially exist, missions that were scrubbed from records, battles fought in the dark spaces between policy and necessity. He'd seen it. He knew what it meant. And in that moment of recognition, his face drained of color like someone had opened a valve and let all the blood drain out. His hand trembled where it gripped the wooden podium, knuckles going white with the force of his grip. He knew I wasn't just some driver who'd lost his way. I was a man who'd been trained to find the rot in a room and cut it out with surgical precision. I made a straight line for the front row, weaving between folding chairs and veterans in their worn dress uniforms, men who'd earned their place here through sacrifice rather than checkbooks. My eyes never left Thorn, never wavered from the target, and I could see the exact moment when he registered my approach. Thorn looked up as I closed the distance, and his smirk widened. It was the smile of a man who'd faced down opposition before and crushed it, who'd learned that money could solve most problems and intimidation could handle the rest. He didn't see a threat in the grease-stained trucker bearing down on him. He saw a fat old man who didn't know his place, who could be dismissed with a word to security, who would scurry back to his truck with his tail between his legs once the proper authorities were involved. He didn't see the way my weight was distributed, balanced, and centered like a fighter waiting for the bell. He didn't notice the way my eyes were scanning, cataloging exits, identifying potential weapons, calculating angles and distances with the automatic precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before in places where mistakes meant body bags. He just saw an old man in his way, and that was his first mistake. "Can I help you, friend?" Thorne asked, his voice dripping with a fake, honeyed concern that set my teeth on edge. The word friend came out like an insult, wrapped in false courtesy. "This is a private event for the elite of the community, for people who matter. I'm afraid you've wandered into the wrong building." He made a show of looking me up and down, his eyes traveling from my mud-caked boots to my worn jacket, lingering on every stain, every frayed edge, every mark of honest labor. His nose wrinkled slightly, as if he could smell the diesel and road grime that no amount of truck stop showers could completely wash away. "You can take your hand off her," I said. My voice was low, quiet, the kind of tone that carries more threat in its restraint than any shouting ever could. It was the voice I'd used in tense negotiations at checkpoints, when the wrong word could mean the difference between everyone going home and a situation spiraling into chaos. The smile never left Thorne's face, but something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of recognition that this wasn't going to be as simple as he'd anticipated. Still, arrogance and habit won out over caution. He laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that echoed off the metal walls of the hangar. "And who are you to tell me anything? You smell like diesel and failure. You look like you haven't seen the inside of a gym or a boardroom in your entire pathetic life." He made a dismissive gesture with his free hand, the one that wasn't still pressed possessively against Sarah's back. "Get out before I have the deputies toss you in the mud, where you belong." He didn't move his hand from Sarah. In fact, and this was what sealed his fate, he gripped her harder, pulling her closer to his side in a deliberate show of dominance, of ownership, of power. He was making a statement to everyone in the room. "This is mine. I can do what I want. And there's nothing any of you can do about it." That was the second line, the moment of no return. My hand moved before my conscious mind fully registered the decision. It wasn't anger. Anger makes you sloppy, makes you telegraph your intentions. This was muscle memory from a lifetime ago, training that had been drilled into me until it became instinct, reflex faster than thought. I reached out and grabbed his wrist, not just grabbed it, but applied a specific pressure point I'd learned in a jungle training camp a lifetime ago, in a place where the instructors spoke 6 languages and taught methods that would never appear in any official military manual. My thumb found the cluster of nerves on the inside of his wrist, and I applied just enough pressure to light up his entire nervous system like a Christmas tree. His face went from smug to purple in a heartbeat. The transformation was almost comical. His eyes bulging, his mouth dropping open in a shocked gasp, the color draining from his cheeks and then flooding back in an angry crimson flush. He let go of Sarah immediately, his fingers releasing her like she'd suddenly become electrified. He tried to pull away, but I maintained the grip, using the leverage to guide him firmly but without unnecessary force out of his seat and toward the side aisle. He stumbled as he rose, his expensive Italian leather shoes slipping slightly on the smooth concrete floor. "She said she was fine." I lied smoothly for his benefit, though Sarah's eyes, wide and glistening with unshed tears, told a very different story. "And I say you're leaving now." That's when Thorne's security detail decided to earn their paychecks. 2 men materialized from their positions along the wall, big guys, both of them, dressed in black tactical shirts with the sleeves rolled up to show off gym-built muscles. They had that particular swagger that comes from weekend warrior courses and too many hours watching action movies, the confidence of men who thought size and aggression were all that mattered in a fight. The one on the left had a shaved head and a neck thick enough to support it, with the kind of cauliflower ears that suggested some grappling experience. The one on the right was leaner, harder looking, with dead eyes that said he'd actually hurt people before and hadn't lost sleep over it. He was the dangerous one. Dead Eyes reached for a holster under his jacket, his hand moving with practiced speed toward what I assumed was either a firearm or a taser. The other one lunged to grab my collar, his meaty hands reaching for the fabric of my jacket to yank me away from his boss. The room erupted into gasps. Chairs scraped backward. Someone, one of the elderly veterans in the third row, shouted, "Hey!" in a voice that cracked with age and alarm. The carefully orchestrated ceremony had disintegrated in seconds, replaced by the chaotic energy of violence about to erupt. The major's voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. "Stand down! Everyone just—" But it was too late. The moment for words had passed. The machinery of conflict was already in motion, and there was no stopping it now. I didn't wait for them to set their positions, didn't give them time to coordinate or execute whatever plan they'd rehearsed. In a fight, initiative is everything. The person who acts first, who disrupts the other side's timing, who forces them to react instead of execute, that person usually walks away. I released Thorne's wrist, letting him stumble backward, and drove my shoulder into the first guard's chest before his hands could close on my collar. I put my full weight behind it, not the weight of a fat trucker, but the centered mass of someone who knows exactly how to transfer kinetic energy through a target. I felt his ribs give way with a satisfying thud, and a sound like green wood cracking. The air exploded out of his lungs in a whoosh, and his eyes went wide with shock and pain. I used his momentum, his body already moving backward from the impact, to pivot toward the second guard. Dead Eyes had cleared his weapon from the holster, a taser I saw now, the distinctive yellow and black housing of a civilian model. He was bringing it up, his finger already moving toward the trigger, his face set in the cold expression of someone who'd done this before. But he was thinking like a security guard. Point, shoot, problem solved. He wasn't thinking like someone who'd trained against armed opponents, who knew that a taser is only effective if you can complete the draw and fire sequence before your target closes the distance. I caught his reaching hand mid-motion, my fingers wrapping around his wrist before the taser could fully level. I twisted downward and back, using basic joint manipulation. Nothing fancy, just simple physics and leverage. His wrist bent at an angle it wasn't designed for, tendons stretching beyond their tolerance, and he let out a sharp cry that was equal parts pain and surprise. The taser clattered to the concrete floor. I kept the pressure on his wrist, using it to control his entire body, and sent him sprawling into a row of metal folding chairs. They collapsed with a deafening roar of metal on metal, the sound echoing through the hangar like a bomb going off. Veterans scrambled to get out of the way, chairs tipping over, programs fluttering to the ground. I stood there in the sudden silence that followed, my breathing steady and controlled, my pulse elevated but not racing. The two guards were down, one clutching his ribs and gasping for air, the other tangled in the wreckage of the chairs and cradling his wrist. Neither of them was getting up quickly. I looked down at Thorne, who had scrambled backward on the floor, his expensive suit collecting dust and grime, his silver hair disheveled, his face twisted with a rage that was finally showing his true nature. The mask of sophistication had cracked, revealing the petty tyrant underneath. The major finally found his voice, but it wasn't to call for the police or to demand order. It was a hushed, terrified whisper that carried through the stunned silence of the hangar, a question that changed everything. "Red Line, is that really you?" The name hung in the air like a ghost taking shape. I saw recognition ripple through some of the older veterans, the ones who'd served in the same dark corners of the world, who'd heard the whispers about operations that never officially happened, and operators who never officially existed. Thorn was staring at me now with new eyes, confusion mixing with his rage. The Major's words had shifted something fundamental in the room's atmosphere. This wasn't just some random trucker anymore. This was something else, someone else. And Thorn, for all his money and influence, was beginning to realize he'd made a terrible miscalculation. The Major's words hung in the humid air of the hangar like a heavy fog, thick with implications that most people in the room couldn't fully grasp. But those who knew, the handful of veterans who'd operated in the shadows, who'd seen things that never made it into official reports, they understood. I could see it in their faces, the way their expressions shifted from confusion to recognition to something that might have been respect or might have been fear. Thorn was back on his feet now, brushing dust and concrete grit from his expensive suit with trembling hands. But the fear that had flickered across his face was already being replaced by something darker, more dangerous: rage. The kind of rage that comes from humiliation, from having your carefully constructed power structure challenged in front of witnesses. His face was contorted with fury, all pretense of sophistication stripped away like paint peeling off rotten wood. This was the real Elias Thorn, the manipulative predator, the bully who'd built an empire by crushing anyone who stood in his way. "I don't care if he's the Queen of England!" Thorn screamed, his voice cracking with the strain, spittle flying from his lips. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his whole arm trembling with barely controlled violence. "He assaulted me! You all saw it! He attacked me unprovoked! Arrest him, now!" The two security guards were clawing their way back to their feet, moving slower than they'd like, pain written in every movement. The one I'd hit in the chest was still gasping, one hand pressed against his ribs, his face pale and sheened with sweat. The one with the damaged wrist had managed to stand, but he was cradling his arm against his chest, his tactical advantage completely neutralized. But the look in his eyes, the dead-eyed one, was pure venom. This wasn't over for him. This had become personal. He didn't reach for his radio this time to call for backup. Instead, his good hand moved to his belt, fingers closing around a collapsible baton that had been tucked into a retention loop. With a sharp flick of his wrist, the weapon extended with a metallic click that echoed through the tense silence. The threat level had just escalated. A baton might not be a firearm, but in the hands of someone who knows how to use it, it's a lethal weapon. And from the way he was gripping it, from the way he was settling into a fighting stance, this guy had training beyond weekend courses. I didn't move. I just stood there, my weight balanced, my hands loose at my sides, watching his eyes. That's where the truth lives. In the eyes. You can fake calm with your body language, fake confidence with your posture, but the eyes always tell you when a man has committed to violence, when he's crossed that internal threshold from posturing to action. Behind me, I could sense Sarah retreating toward the wall, her breathing quick and shallow. She was smart enough to get out of the strike zone, to put distance between herself and what was about to happen. I could hear the shuffle of feet as other people backed away, creating a circle of empty space around us, like spectators at some brutal gladiatorial contest. The local deputies at the door, 2 of them, both young, both looking uncertain, were hesitating, their hands hovering near their duty belts but not committing. They kept glancing toward the Major, waiting for guidance, for someone to tell them what to do in this situation that had spiraled far beyond a simple disturbance. But Thorn's men weren't waiting for orders or guidance or any semblance of proper procedure. The big one with the baton lunged first, his patience exhausted, his ego demanding retribution. He swung for my temple with blind, amateurish power, the kind of swing that comes from rage rather than training, telegraphed and committed, leaving him completely open. I stepped inside the arc of the swing, moving toward the threat rather than away from it. The baton whistled past my ear close enough that I could feel the displaced air, close enough that if I'd been a half-second slower, it would have caved in my skull. But I wasn't slower. I was exactly where I needed to be, inside his reach, where his weapon became a liability rather than an advantage. I drove my palm up into his chin with a force that came from my legs, my hips, my core. the full kinetic chain of a properly executed strike. His head snapped back with a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil, his teeth clacking together with enough force that I wouldn't be surprised if he cracked a molar. His eyes rolled back, his brain rattling inside his skull from the impact. Before he could recover his footing, before his vision could clear from the stars that had to be exploding behind his eyes, I grabbed his wrist, the one holding the baton, and twisted. The weapon came free easily, tumbling from nerveless fingers as I applied a basic joint lock that had him gasping in pain. I used the baton as a lever, not a striking weapon. Violence should be controlled, purposeful, never excessive. I pinned the second guard's arm against his own chest as he tried to tackle me from the side, using his momentum and the rigid metal of the baton to redirect his force. I drove him backward into a heavy catering table laden with coffee urns and pastries. The crash was spectacular. Glass shattered, ceramic plates exploded into fragments, coffee spilled across the floor in a dark, steaming river. The guard went down hard, landing among the wreckage with a grunt of pain and shock. It wasn't a movie fight with choreographed moves and dramatic pauses. It was short, brutal, efficient, and calculated. I was breathing through my nose, my pulse elevated but steady, controlled. They were gasping for air, their earlier confidence shattered as completely as the dishes scattered across the floor. "That's enough!" The major's voice cracked across the room like a whip, sharp and commanding, carrying the weight of decades of authority. He walked straight through the crowd, people parting before him automatically, responding to the command presence that came naturally to men who'd led soldiers into combat. He stopped exactly 3 feet away from me, his back ramrod straight despite his age, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that was almost physical. Up close, I could see how much he'd aged since the last time I'd seen him. More grey in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes, but the same sharp intelligence, the same core of steel. "I haven't seen that ring since the day we pulled the survivors out of the wreckage in the Helmand province," the major said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly tone that only I could hear clearly. "The man wearing it was supposed to be a ghost. They told us he never came home. They told us he died in that valley." I looked down at the ring on my right hand, the heavy silver band with the notched edge and the faded unit crest that I'd never been able to bring myself to remove. It was a weight I carried, a reminder of who I'd been, what I'd done, the brothers I'd lost. "Some parts of him didn't," I said quietly, the words coming from a place deep inside that I usually kept locked away. My voice was rough with emotion I hadn't expected to feel. The parts that mattered, they stayed in that valley with the others. The major nodded slowly, understanding passing between us without need for further explanation. He'd been there. He knew what it cost. But Thorn, watching this exchange with growing fury and confusion, saw only his control slipping away, his power being challenged, his carefully constructed evening turning into a disaster that would have consequences he couldn't yet fully calculate. He'd backed away toward the exit during the fight, his phone already in his hand, his fingers moving across the screen with the desperate speed of someone calling in reinforcements. His eyes were darting around the room like a cornered rat looking for an escape route. "You're done, Major," he spat, his voice taking on a different quality now. Cold, calculating, threatening in the way that only men with real institutional power can threaten. "My company owns the land this VFW post sits on. I hold the deed. I control the lease. I'll have the bulldozers here by Monday morning, and there's nothing you or your collection of broken-down veterans can do about it." He pointed at me, his hand still shaking, but his voice gaining strength as he retreated into the familiar comfort of wielding power from behind lawyers and money. "And as for you, trucker, you're going to prison for what you did to my men. Assault, battery, maybe attempted murder if I can get the right prosecutor. You'll spend the rest of your pathetic life in a cell, and I'll make sure every day of it is miserable." He thought he still held the cards. He thought the law was a tool he could buy and sell like real estate, that money and connections were armor against consequences. He started to walk toward the exit, his chest puffing out again as he regained his composure, his arrogance reasserting itself. But then he stopped. He stopped because he heard what I'd been waiting to hear for the last 5 minutes. The sound of heavy air brakes began to hiss outside the hangar, a rhythmic mechanical chorus that started with 1 and then multiplied. 2, 3, 5, a dozen. The ground began to vibrate with the low-end rumble of multiple high-displacement diesel engines, a frequency you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. Huge beams of white light cut through the darkness beyond the open hangar doors, high-intensity LED headlights and auxiliary floods illuminating the rain-slicked pavement in a blinding crossfire. The light was so intense it created harsh shadows inside the hangar, turning the space into something almost theatrical. Thorne squinted into the glare, raising one hand to shield his eyes, his confident stride faltering. "What the hell is this?" I adjusted my cap and took a step toward the door, feeling the familiar comfort of the Brotherhood arriving right on schedule. My presence was now framed by the arrival of the cavalry, silhouetted against the lights like some figure from an old western. "That's the cavalry," I said, allowing myself a small, cold smile. "And they've been recording your private event from the moment you started harassing that widow in the parking lot before the ceremony even began." The Major looked at me, a question forming in his eyes, confusion mixed with dawning understanding. I just pointed toward my Peterbilt, parked right at the edge of the light pool, its chrome gleaming in the LED floods. The truck sat there like a sentinel, and mounted on the dashboard, clearly visible even from this distance, was the wide-angle lens of my Dashcam. The camera had been pointed directly through the open hangar doors the entire time, silently recording every word, every gesture, every moment of Thorne's harassment. Modern dashcams don't just record, they stream to the cloud in real time, creating a digital record that can't be destroyed or disappeared, even if someone smashes the physical device. Thorne's face drained of color as the implications hit him like a freight train. His hand went slack, his phone nearly slipping from his fingers. The physical situation had changed irreversibly, and he was finally beginning to understand just how badly he'd miscalculated. "You think a few trucks change anything?" Thorne hissed, but his voice lacked the earlier bite. The bravado was cracking, fear bleeding through the gaps. "I have lawyers, expensive lawyers, the best lawyers money can buy. They'll eat you alive in court. They'll bury you in motions and paperwork until you're bankrupt." The air grew thick with the smell of wet asphalt and diesel fuel, a sensory reminder that the road always finds a way to deliver justice, even when the courts fail. Outside, truck doors were opening with heavy metallic thuds, boots hitting pavement in a synchronized rhythm that spoke of coordination and purpose. Thorne's security guards were slow to rise from the wreckage of their confrontation, their earlier confidence replaced by the realization that they were now surrounded by a wall of steel and men who didn't take kindly to bullies. The bigger one was still clutching his ribs, his face pale and sweaty. The dead-eyed one was cradling his damaged wrist, but his eyes were tracking the movement outside with professional wariness. "Maybe," I said, stepping closer to Thorne until he had to look up at me, until he could see his own reflection in my eyes and understand that he was facing something his money couldn't buy his way out of. "But lawyers can't erase a live stream that's already been archived on a dozen servers, and they can't stop 40 truckers from making sure Sarah gets home safe tonight and every night after." The Major stepped beside me, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder in a gesture of solidarity that bridged the gap between my past and this present moment. It was a touch that said, "I see you. I remember you. I stand with you." The room was silent now, save for the deep rumble of the idling rigs outside and the steady drumming of rain on the metal roof. The injustice that had fueled the evening was being met with the cold, hard reality of accountability. Big Mike was the first through the door, 6'4" of flannel and denim, with hands like catcher's mitts and a beard that would make a lumberjack jealous. He'd pulled me out of a snowbank in the Rockies 3 winters ago when my engine had died in a whiteout, Behind him came Deacon, lean and wire-tight, a former paralegal who knew more about the law of the road and the law of the land than any suit in a high-rise corner office. They didn't come in shouting or making threats. They just walked in and stood behind me, a living barrier of solidarity. More followed, drivers I'd shared coffee with at truck stops, men and women who'd helped me change a tire in the rain, people who understood that the Brotherhood of the road meant something real. Thorn tried to make a break for it, his survival instincts finally overriding his ego. He bolted toward the side exit of the hangar, his expensive shoes slipping on the smooth concrete as he ran. But he didn't realize that when a trucker sets a line, nothing crosses it without permission. I was moving before he even hit the pavement outside. The rain was coming down in sheets now, the earlier drizzle having intensified into a proper storm. The parking lot had transformed into a treacherous surface of standing water and slick clay. But I've spent decades mastering traction on surfaces most men wouldn't dare walk on. Thorn reached his sleek black Mercedes, a S-Class that probably cost more than most people's houses, fumbling with his key fob, his hands shaking so badly he could barely press the button. But I didn't give him the chance to close the distance to safety. I caught him by the collar of his expensive wool coat, just as his fingers closed around the door handle. He spun around, swinging a desperate, wild punch that telegraphed from a mile away. I caught it effortlessly in the palm of my hand, the impact echoing through the damp night air like a baseball hitting a catcher's mitt. I squeezed. Not enough to break bones, but enough to make a point. His eyes went wide as he felt the strength in a grip built from decades of wrestling with airlines and tie-down straps, from turning wrenches and hauling chains, from moving 80,000 pounds of freight across a continent. "The keys, Thorn," I said quietly, my voice barely audible over the roar of the idling diesel engines that surrounded us. "Get off me! You're a nobody, a highway rat," he spat, his voice cracking with fear he could no longer hide. "My father was a senator. I have connections. You can't do this to me." He tried to knee me in the gut, a dirty, desperate move from someone who'd run out of options. I countered by shifting my weight and sweeping his standing leg out from under him. He hit the wet asphalt hard, the breath leaving his lungs in a sharp wheeze, rainwater splashing up around him. Before his security detail could regroup and rush out of the hangar to save their employer, a wall of white light hit the parking lot with the intensity of a prison yard searchlight. 3 massive, long-nosed Peterbilts swung into position with coordinated precision, their chrome bumpers gleaming like shields as they boxed in Thorn's Mercedes and blocked every exit route. Deacon stepped forward through the rain, holding up a tablet that was tethered to my truck's mobile Wi-Fi hotspot. The screen glowed blue in the darkness, showing a paused video feed. "Every word you said to Sarah inside," he announced, his voice carrying over the storm and the engines. "Every threat you made about bulldozing this post, about buying and selling people like property. It's all on the cloud, Thorn, backed up on multiple servers across 3 states. He tapped the screen, and I could see Thorn's face go even paler as he recognized the footage. "My Dashcam has a panoramic wide-angle lens. It caught you pinning her against that wall in the parking lot before the ceremony even started. It caught every word of your threats, every unwanted touch. The timestamp is there. The GPS coordinates are embedded in the metadata. This isn't going away." Thorn looked at the screen, then at the silent wall of truckers standing in the rain, then at me. The strategic situation had changed irreversibly. There was no talking his way out of digital evidence, no lawyer skilled enough to make video footage disappear, no amount of money that could erase the cloud. The Major walked down the steps from the hangar, his boots splashing in the puddles, his uniform getting soaked, but his bearing still military straight. He didn't look at Thorn sprawled in the mud. He looked at me, at the ghost who had come back to life to finish one last mission. "I'll take it from here, Redline," the Major said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that Thorn had only ever pretended to possess. The sheriff is 2 minutes out. He's already seen the footage. There's a warrant being prepared as we speak. Harassment, assault, attempted extortion. And the deed to this land, I made some calls. Turns out there are some irregularities in how you acquired it. The state attorney general is very interested in reviewing the transaction. I let go of Thorne's collar, watching him slump against his expensive tires. A broken man stripped of his perceived power, reduced to what he'd always been underneath the money and the suits. Just another bully who'd finally met someone he couldn't intimidate. I didn't feel joy or triumph, just a grim sense of completion, of a job done. My knuckles were sore from the earlier fight, and the damp cold was starting to seep into my old injuries, the shoulder that had been dislocated in Kandahar, the knee that had never quite healed right after a parachute malfunction. Every fight has a price, and I was starting to feel the bill come due. I turned back toward my rig, the lights of the other trucks beginning to dim as the immediate threat evaporated. The Brotherhood would disperse now, melting back into the night and the highways, ghosts on the road who'd appeared when needed, and would disappear just as quickly. Sarah was standing by the passenger door of my Peterbilt. The folded flag still clutched to her chest, but she wasn't crying anymore. Her shoulders were back, her chin up. For the first time that night, she looked like she could breathe, like a weight had been lifted that she'd been carrying alone for too long. I didn't wait for the handcuffs to click shut on Thorne's wrists. A trucker knows that once the dust settles, it's time to find the white lines again, to get back to the rhythm of the road that makes sense when nothing else does. "You didn't have to do that," Sarah whispered as I approached, her voice barely audible over the low thrum of my engine. "He would have ruined you, destroyed your life, everything you've built. People like him always think they can own the road," I said, climbing onto the step but keeping my eyes on her level, treating her with the respect she deserved. "They forget that the road belongs to the people who actually move the world, who keep the country running while they sleep in their comfortable beds. You're safe now, Sarah. That flag in your hand, it means something to us. It means you're never alone on this highway." I reached into the cab and pulled out my old leather bomber jacket, the one with the faded patches from a life I usually keep locked in the sleeper berth, the one with unit insignias that didn't officially exist. I draped it over her shoulders to shield her from the Ohio chill and the rain that was still falling. She looked up at me, and for a second, the ghost of the man I used to be and the man I am now stood in the same pair of boots, occupying the same space, finally reconciled. The Major approached, stopping at the edge of my driver's side door. He didn't offer a salute. That would have drawn too much attention to what I was, what I'd been. But he gave me a sharp, knowing nod that said everything the medals and ceremonies couldn't. "Where are you heading, Red Line?" "West," I said, engaging the air brakes and feeling the familiar hiss of the pneumatic system releasing. "There's a load of produce in Nebraska that won't wait for a reunion, and I've got a lot of pavement to cover before the sun catches up with me." I checked my mirrors, seeing the Brotherhood of trucks slowly dispersing into the night, their red taillights fading into the misty darkness like dying embers. They didn't need thanks, and I didn't need to give it. We all knew why we were there. The code of the road doesn't require explanations. As I pulled out of the VFW lot, I saw Thorne being pushed into the back of a sheriff's cruiser, his expensive suit ruined by the very mud he'd threatened to kick me into. There was poetry in that, I suppose. Justice delivered not by courts or lawyers, but by the simple truth captured by a dashcam and the solidarity of people who refuse to look away when someone needs help. I shifted through the gears, feeling the familiar weight of the trailer settling in behind me, the slight resistance as the fifth wheel took the load and the drivetrain found its rhythm. The interior of the cab was dark, except for the green glow of the instrument cluster and the amber clearance lights reflecting off the wet pavement ahead. I looked at the empty passenger seat, then back at the road stretching out before me. My reflection in the rain-streaked window looked older, more tired, but somehow at peace. I'd come to this VFW post for a memory, to pay respects to a fallen brother. But I was leaving with something more valuable, the knowledge that some things never change, no matter how many miles you put between yourself and the past. Honor, protection, the silent code of the long haul. The understanding that sometimes the road calls you to do more than just deliver freight from point A to point B. The highway opened up before me, a black ribbon cutting through the heart of the country, painted lines disappearing into the darkness. I was just another trucker moving freight now, a shadow in the night, carrying the truth in a dashcam recording and the weight of a silver ring on my finger. The rain was letting up, the storm passing as storms do, leaving everything clean and new in its wake. Somewhere behind me, Sarah was safe. The VFW post was secure. And Thorne was learning that money can't buy your way out of everything. I reached out and patted the dashboard of my Pete, the old ritual. "Just you and me, girl," I muttered into the silence. "Let's get this load home." The road stretched on, endless and infinite, and I had promises to keep. Thank you for watching. And if stories like this one about courage, sacrifice, and second chances speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us.